So I'm gonna do another little series. Um, this one's on philosophical concepts. So background is I'm a Taoist. I've been a Taoist for a third of a century, and I highly recommend Witter Bynner's translation of the Tao Te Ching. Instead of trying to translate each word, he was a poet with a background in translating various classic Chinese texts. And so he translated the meanings of the statements in context rather than just word for word. So his translation hits a lot better for English speakers. And Taoism is a very old perspective. You can argue about when exactly it arose, somewhere 2,300 to 2,600 years ago. You can argue about who the specific actual authors were. That's not really the point because it was referring to a set of wisdom traditions which go back much further to pre-agricultural times. So it's really the ancient wisdom of the people in that area. And unfortunately, even though it's thousands and thousands of years old, you guys are having trouble catching up. It wasn't until just the last century that Western philosophy caught up to a few of the basic ideas in Taoism. And it's important to recognize that Taoism is not Confucianism or Buddhism. Those are the most common responses I get when I tell someone I'm Taoist. They think that I just sit on a mountaintop meditating. Lao Tzu lived in one of the biggest cities of his time. He was a librarian back when libraries were a private institution serving the emperor because knowledge was power. And he was speaking to people living in a city of high class. So he was not just wandering the mountains meditating. And Taoists don't even recommend meditating. We're going to tell you be useful. Enter the flow state while you're doing something useful. So let's look at a couple concepts in Taoism that are really critical. First is this idea of the difference between the actual events and the words you use to describe those events. The actual event is a real physical fact. And then as soon as you use words to describe that event, you are trespassing into a place that is always imperfect. So there's a way that someone could actually be in their life. When they're living it, they're doing certain things. And that's a way of being. That's what the way of life is the way of being. But then as soon as you try to describe the way that they're being, you're going to start fumbling because words are imperfect. So this is the same concept as like you can learn how to ride a bike, but then if you try to tell someone how to ride a bike, it's not really the same. You can look at a stippling where they make little dots on a page. You look at a stippling of a wave on a beach, or a rolling cloud in the sky, or undulating sand dunes. And they're very similar. Those stipplings are similar in a way that you can't use words to define their differences. But when you look at them, you can tell the difference between them. You are able to see and discern the difference between a wave on a beach and a rolling cloud and a sand dune, even though you can't explain perfectly what that exact distinction is. So that's when Taoists say that you can tell beyond words. It means that you can tell the difference even if you can't tell someone what that difference is. And so that's why the opening lines of the Tao Te Ching, even though they're translated many different ways, they're basically saying the Tao is a way of being, and the way of being encompasses all the instances. Every way that fits within the Tao is part of Tao, and it's got a lot of diversity and a lot of specificity and nuance. But as soon as you try to capture that whole way of being in words, it's too big, it's too fuzzy. There's all these little nitpicky things you're going to have to say, and someone's going to misapply it or misunderstand it, or there's some limitation of the word's definitions in your language. So the Tao that can be named is not the real Tao. Existence is beyond the power of words to define. This is an important concept in Taoism. And there's a few examples that might help to conceptualize this. If I took you into a cave, I'm like a cave explorer spelunking, and I'm telling you, we're going to go down this cave, and I'm going to warn you, at the end of the cave, there's this deep pit, and we can't see where it is because it's a pit. It's completely black. There's no light coming back. You're not going to see it because it's pitch black in the pit. But what I can do to show you where the pit is I brought all these tea candles. I'm going to light up these tea candles, and then I'm going to place them around the edge of the pit. And then you'll be able to see where the pit is from, knowing that the pit is inside of the bounds of these tea candles. I can't place the tea candle on the pit because it'll fall down. But I can go to the ledge that's just outside of the pit and place a tea candle there. The tea candle is not showing you where the pit is. The tea candle is outside of the pit. I'm giving you an example in words that's not the Tao. But I can surround the Tao with words. None of those words are the Tao, but I've encompassed the Tao. And you know that the Tao is somewhere inside of that perimeter. So that's one way of thinking about the concept, is I can use words to lay tea candles outside of the Tao, and I can try to give enough examples that you can see basically the Tao is somewhere inside of those bounds. And another concept, another way of framing it that might help. Neural net researchers will understand this one easily because they run into this problem, this exact problem over and over again. If I take photographs, I made a Polaroid for it. You can tell I'm old. If I take photographs of every piece of furniture that's ever existed, not every instance, but every kind of furniture. There's this piece, and there's this kind of piece, and this kind of piece. So I've got love seats and lazy boys and coffee tables and couches of every manufacturer, every style, the whole range. I take photos of every single kind. And then I'm going to lay all these photos out on a big board where the photos that look similar are closer to each other, and the photos that look different from each other are further away. And this is what happens when a neural network researcher looks at how an AI is sorting images by KL divergence, Kullback-Leibler divergence. So the image similarity. And now we've got this big map of all the different pieces of furniture that have ever existed. They're all laid out. And I'm going to show these photos to people. And I'm not going to ask the person, could you call this a chair? Because they could call the stump of a tree a chair. They could call the roof of a house a chair. They could call their friend leaning over, letting you sit on their back. They could be like, yeah, that's technically a chair. No, I'm going to show them the photo and ask, what is this? And if their response is, that is a chair, if that's the majority of the population agrees that that's a chair, when I just ask, what is this? Then those are the chairs. So I'm going to take all the photos that got classified as a chair. This is what neural network AI researchers do. So I've got all the chairs labeled on this whole map of visual similarity. And now my job is to take a Sharpie and draw a line that separates the chairs from the not chairs on this map of visual similarity. Now, if I try to do that, the line that separates chairs from not chairs is going to be this crazy thing going on. There's this crazy, weird shape. And it's fractal. Well, it's not exactly like a self-similar fractal, but I mean that it has infinitely fine-grained resolution. If you zoom in on a certain area, there's going to be more wiggly to it. and zoom in more, and it's fractal dimensioned, where each scale has a certain amount of variance, and then as you zoom in, there's more variance within the smaller scales. So fractal dimensioned would be the better terminology. Math guy, jargon. We could get perfect about jargon, and then you wouldn't understand me. But that's the problem of words. So you've got this boundary between chair and not chair, and it's all this wiggly, infinitely fine-grained curve. And now if I try to define what a chair is using words, words are a delineation. They're like a line. And so I can use a few words to define a chair, and it's kind of like drawing a rectangle around that region. If I just use a few words, it's kind of like a rectangle. It's blocky. It's granular. And that short definition of a chair is going to include things that aren't actually chairs. And it's going to exclude things that are actually chairs. And so I say, well, okay, let me add a few more words to get more specific. And now I draw new blocky lines to get finer resolution, more detailed granularity. And even then, there's going to be some examples that I include that are not chairs. And there's going to be some examples that I exclude that are chairs. And so I say, okay, I'm going to add more words, and I add lots and lots of words. And it's fractal dimensioned. It's a fractal dimension curve. So it's not going to ever resolve. If I wanted to give a perfect definition of what a chair is, I would need an infinite number of words. So you're going to have to give up on that. Anytime I use words, and you can look at each of my statements and be like, oh, there's an example there. Anytime that I use words, you will always be able to find a counterfactual case. You'll be able to say, well, Anthony, you said that it's this, but there's really this one example that you included that's not. And there's this other example you didn't include that is. That's always the case as a result of the limitations of words themselves. That does not indicate anything about the real category or the concept being expressed. And Westerners have a big problem with this. Westerners have this legalist framework in their mind where they think that the words are the true and complete definition of real things. And so they want to use words to perfectly explain ethics. They want to use words to perfectly explain principles. And that's not possible. Any of our abstract concepts, we will never be able to give a perfect definition in words. You will always find counterexamples. And finding a counterexample in the words does not defeat the concept. The concept existed outside of words. And you have to trespass into words to communicate that you're talking about that concept. So that's a key principle in Taoism we've known for a few millennia. And you guys haven't caught up yet because you are obsessed with this fantasy that words are somehow perfect when there has never been any indication of that. There's counterexample after counterexample after counterexample proving you wrong. But you still want to insist that if I'm following ethics, then the only way for me to follow ethics is for me to describe in words. I have to use a limited number of words. You say 3 sentences. I hear this all the time. Tell me in just a few sentences. Describe in a few words your ethical principles. And then when I have to trespass into words to give a short answer for them, then they start finding counterexamples. And I say, well, of course you're going to find counterexamples because I only had a finite number of words. That's always the case. And we can look at other examples of this failure in Western cognition about language versus reality. People think that if you can define a set of behaviors with words, then that's a match for the actual behavior. And as a result, they will take what someone else said as an ethical principle, and then they'll follow the words even when the words in that case are not a match for the ethics. They've used a limited number of words, and then they're jumping on one of the counterfactuals, one of the counterexamples, where the words are not perfect, they're not explaining the ethics correctly, and then they exploit that. They say, technically, according to the words, technically, but if you're only following the words, the letter of the law, instead of the spirit of the law, then technically, by the letter of the law, this is okay. Yeah, that's obviously a hack. You're exploiting the imperfection of words, and it proves that your goal is to exploit. So Taoists say the way to do is to be, instead of trying to find the perfect words to convince other people of a concept that is fundamentally beyond words. So Taoists are going to be Tao, and when you ask them what that is, they say, look at the examples. Look at each example, and they say, oh, are all those examples a complete description? No, they can't be. You would need an infinite number of examples. Well, then define Tao. Well, if I define Tao, you're going to be able to find counterexamples and failure points in the words that I used. And if you just look at the words that I used and follow the words as your boundary, then you're going to be exploiting the words to do things that are definitely not Tao. So let's look instead at how you find Tao in action, what the real Tao is as opposed to the words. There's a methodology to discover it, because you can't just tell someone with words what it is. When nature prefers something, the reason nature prefers it is because it does actually function in reality for the goals of persistence and resilience. So if you're a philosophy nerd, I'm just going to say an easy way to point to this concept is take consequentialism to the limit as it approaches infinity. If you're looking at the consequences on a longer and longer time frame, you are now approaching the Tao. So another way of looking at it is Darwin Awards. If there is a way of being for an organism in an ecology, and that way of being causes that organism to go extinct, or that species to go extinct, or the ecology to collapse, then we know it's not Tao, because it caused collapse. The Tao is the way of life. So nature's creating all these different life forms. There's a huge amount of mutations being tried. Most of them get trimmed off. Nature decides no. Nature cuts them away. 98% of all species that have ever existed on Earth are already extinct. And it wasn't humans that did it. It's billions of years of extinction. So if you want to not go extinct, then you have to learn the ways of the creatures that didn't. So a Taoist is going to say that a horseshoe crab has a kind of Tao. It's not the only Tao, it's not the full Tao, but horseshoe crabs have been around for a long time. They have some kind of Tao that they've been able to persist and be resilient. My favorite example of that way of being example of Tao is the desert frog. And desert frogs, you'd think, well, a frog has to stay wet. Well, desert seems like the wrong place for a frog. And what the frogs in the desert do is when there's a torrential rain once a year, it turns the whole ground into mud. The frog burrows deep into the mud, and then when the ground dries out, it sucks all the water out of the frog. And it actually mummifies. It's called acidivation. So it's not alive at that point. Its brain has stopped, its heart has stopped, it has no metabolism. It is in suspended animation, dehydrated. And when the rains hit heavy enough again to get the mud that far down, that's when the frog wakes up and comes to the surface. And then they procreate, and there's the desert frog. So there have been desert frogs found in the ground that were 150 years old. And they could very well be much older. You could find frogs that are hundreds and hundreds of years old, because there's really no time limit at that point. Once you're completely dried out and you're in suspended animation, time doesn't count. So, thinking about that, there might be a desert frog that burrows down, dries out. It has no consciousness, it has no heartbeat, it has no metabolism. It's down there for hundreds of years, and in the meantime, we have all of industrialization and expanding across the globe and international trade and technology, and then we blow ourselves up, and the whole world's covered in radiation or what, however we manage to do it. And then nature starts to recover hundreds of years later, and then the desert frog wakes up. That desert frog, when they burrowed down into the mud, they're like, oh, there's pioneers out here. That's weird. And then they wake up hundreds of years later and they're like, where'd all the humans go? Oh, well. So that's a kind of Tao. Here's another kind of Tao that I'm going to point to, because Taoism says things that some people like to misrepresent as identical or similar to other philosophies because they don't understand how it applies, how the real lived Tao works. So I'm going to tear down Nietzsche. Nietzsche liked to epitomize the Übermensch, the higher being who pushes civilization forward, as like a tiger or an eagle, like this vicious predator, as if they're strong. And there's no indication that they're strong. You look at reality, there's no indication that eagles and tigers are strong. All those top predators are just you using words to confuse yourself. Because every time there's a top predator, what they are is a very small niche that is very unstable. All the top predators that you point to as being so strong are endangered. They are endangered species. Nature keeps telling you that they are actually very weak and vulnerable. If a tiger was not covered in giant knives, it would definitely die out. They need all that weaponry and muscle to just barely exist, which tells you that they are weak. That is a weakness. That is a weak organism. They have a small population. They're incredibly vulnerable to disruption. And if they didn't have all those weapons and muscle, they would go extinct very quickly. And in contrast, you have the mouse. This is an example of Taoism. So Australia, it's massive, mostly desert, really intense climate. It's full of vicious animals like the cassowary and all kinds of poisonous things. It's a harsh environment, and it's very unforgiving. But when mice arrived, they screwed everything up. Australians have been trying for generations to defeat the mice. You think humans are so advanced with all our technology and weaponry. We can't defeat mice. Every decade or so in Australia, there is a horde of just a wave of mice sweeping through, eating everything, destroying all the crops, chewing through your power lines. Everything gets chewed apart. And if there's even just a tiny little crack somewhere that's big enough for a baby mouse, there's mice on the other side. So the mouse is stronger than everything in Australia. That's Taoism.